We're beginning the study of Northern Renaissance art by looking at art in Bohemia at the last part of the 14th and the very early 15th century. The major art patron in Bohemia was the king, Charles IV, or the Emperor Charles IV. He was born with a Slavic name, Wenceslas, which he later changed to the French Charles. He was educated in France from the age of 7, and he had international contacts, obviously with the court of France, but also the popes at Avignon and with Italy. He became the Holy Roman Emperor, so he went down. He was crowned in Milan and in Rome. Among his accomplishments, he reformed the Bohemian constitution. Under his rule, and his influence with the popes, Prague became an archbishopric. In other words, Prague had had a bishop, but now it has an archbishop, which shows the importance of this city. Charles also founded the University of Prague and became a major patron for art and architecture. He rebuilt the Castle of Prague, and he had the Cathedral of Prague rebuilt as this new French flamboyant Gothic style. The Cathedral of Prague, of course, is dedicated to Saint Vitus. And in doing so, he imported artists to work on the cathedral. St. Vitus had been a Romanesque church, but Charles decided that it should be rebuilt in the new, modern French style. And so he called in architects. The first one was Matthias of Arras, but he died. And then his assistant, Peter Parler, became the master mason. Now, this meant that he fulfilled the posts of what we would call an architect, as well as what we would call a general contractor. They didn't have a separate architect from the builder. So the master mason is in charge of designing the church and building the church. And as we'll see, he also is a sculptor. And he's a worker in stone. Now, most of the church was built after Parler's death. Only the choir, which we see here, was finished by his death. But the sculpture that he left is very remarkable, because this is a move toward greater verisimilitude, toward greater realism or naturalism, and he has carved these heads up along the triforium of the nave of the church, and they seem to be true portraits. In other words, likenesses, not just if you have a king, you have a figure that's sort of generic, with a crown or a scepter that tells you he's the king. In this case, we see a true portrait of Parler himself, which we're looking at now. And then you're going to see it here from a slightly different angle, looking up. And it's, as you can see, it comes out of the wall. It sort of emerges, and you have this very realistic image of the sculptor, architect, mason himself. Also, he created portrait busts, same place, of the Emperor, Charles IV of Bohemia. And I should warn you, don't confuse him with Charles IV of France, who's a very different person. And here is the Bohemian Emperor's third wife, Anna von Schweidnitz. But as you can see, these look like very realistic images. Even when he can't look at the actual person, he creates an image that seems to be a portrait. So what we're looking at here is the tomb effigy from the tomb of Ottocar I. When the choir of St. Vitus was rebuilt, they reinterred the kings of Bohemia, the predecessors of Charles. And he wanted them to be in the choir with these new tombs, which were the effigies on the top of the tomb would be carved by Peter Parler. Now, of course, he can't go back in time and see what the kings actually looked like. So what he does is carve very realistic images that are imaginary portraits. So these are about 1377, and we're looking down at the effigy here. Or you can think of it if you want to as though it were tipped up so we could see it, but we're looking straight on. And you can see that the proportions are somewhat squat and broad, and that the draperies are these solid, massive drapery folds that wrap the body. And somewhat obscure the body in a sense too, but make you really feel as though there must be a body beneath that. So once again, we're seeing Peter Parler create this new realism or new naturalism in his time. The Germans have a word for this. It's plastique, which is spelled just like plastic, only it doesn't mean artificial materials. It means solid, three-dimensional. And it's a very useful word, so this has the qualities of being plastique. The nose, as you can see, has been broken off. But when you look at the close-up of the face, you can see that you have very individualized features. They look very naturalistic. You could believe that this may have been how Ottocar I could have looked. Of course, Parler didn't know. It's an imaginary portrait. Did he use someone for a model? We don't know. But it's also interesting to contrast what Peter Parler is doing in Prague in the 14th century, in the 1370s, with, well, it's not exactly contemporary, but slightly earlier, about 47 years earlier. In Cologne Cathedral, we have these beautiful high Gothic sculptures. And so here is the image of Christ. And as you can see, Christ is very, very slender and elegant and courtly as compared to the squat frontal position of Ottocar. The draperies are somewhat different as well. In the Cologne High Gothic Christ, you have the elegant swag of draperies that pulls up to one side, because you can see Christ is what we call the hip shot pose, or the S, or the reverse S pose, where the hip is thrust out and it makes a beautiful arc of the body, a beautiful curve of the whole body. And the draperies reinforce this by being pulled up to one side to the hip, or in this case to where Christ is holding the orb and cross, and then they cascade down with the graceful folds. With Ottocar, it's as though he is holding these very, very heavy draperies, his arms stretched out in front of us, and there's no hip shot position. He's directly in front of us. Well, of course, he is a tomb effigy, but still, you have this heavy, massive, solid, plastique naturalistic image compared to the elegant, courtly, idealized, graceful image of the High Gothic. So there really is a change in the style of the sculpture. Well, let's see what Bohemian painting was doing about this time. We're looking here at about 1350 to 1390. And there have been identified as 3 styles of Bohemian painting, which seem to be associated with 3 different masters. Now, we don't always know the name of an artist. Sometimes we have names in documents, but they're not connected to any works of art. We don't know what those people actually created. We may know they were, paid for something. in this case, we have works of art with very distinctive styles, but we don't know the name of the artist. So we give the artist conventional names. In this case, they're named for the altarpiece, and the altarpiece is called after its original location. So we have the master of the Vyšší Brod Altarpiece from about 1350 to 60. And as we look at, we'll see the interesting colors. We have pastels and these mixed colors and different levels of saturation with very slender figures and great interest in decorative patterns. And then almost the opposite, the master Theodoric of Prague, contemporary, a little bit later perhaps, but only by a few years. Certainly the artists were living at the same time. 1357 to 67 is when the works that we'll look at are usually dated. They have some documentation on those dates. That's why they're so specific. And he used these massive broad forms. And then we have another artist who's using very slender figures, the master of the Trebon altarpiece. This is a bit later, 1385, 90. And he is noted because he's extremely emotive. He elicits strong emotion from the viewer. He's even been called expressionistic. And we'll also see how he sometimes uses saturated color and shapes that have a very emotive feeling to them. So let's look at what we're talking about. The first artist, the earliest one, is the master of the Vyšší Brod Altarpiece. And this altarpiece is dated about the middle of the 14th century, around 1350. It's called the Vyšší Brod Altarpiece because it is from a Cistercian monastery at the town of Vyšší Brod, which in German is called Hohenfurth. So when I first heard about these artists, they were usually called by their German name, but now that's been changed to use the Slavic names. They didn't like having their towns renamed in German, I guess. This was a polyptych or a many-paneled altarpiece from which we have some surviving panels. And this is one of them. It's now in the National Gallery of Prague, and it shows the Nativity of Christ. The panels are each, of course, a panel. When we say panel, we mean a piece of wood. And in this case, the wood has been covered with canvas, and then the painting media is tempera. Tempera is an water-based medium. You would grind the pigments up and mix them with water. And frequently, you would also use something like egg yolk to use as a binder. I don't know whether these are egg tempera or not. We know we know the family of the patron. We don't know exactly which person it may have been because we see him here kneeling at the corner in this rich garment with this deeply saturated blue and the white fur around his neck. And beside him is this shield, which has the arms of the family, and those can be identified. As you see, it's a great rose. And this is the family that might be translated as Rosenberg. You'll notice that the donor is very, very small in relationship to Mary and Joseph and even the midwife or the servant woman here. But that would show, his humility, that he's so much less important than the holy figures. And in his hands is a little church, a little model of the church, presumably the monastery church in which this altarpiece was placed. And he's offering it to the Virgin Mary. Now, it's sometimes said, as your book said, that there is Byzantine influence in this. I'm not sure that it's really very strong. There's a few elements that may remind people of Byzantine art. The rocks, as you can see, are these little jagged and curving, flat-topped, almost flat plateaus with these sheer cliff-like verticals at the each end, and those have been called iceberg rocks. That when you see them in Byzantine art, here there's a multitude of them. They've really magnified and increased the number so that they form a kind of decorative pattern, which is somewhat the shape of the cloud formations that you see above, up in the corner. Talk about those in a minute. The other thing that's been compared to Byzantine art are the facial features. Now, in Byzantine art, for example, the Madonna might have what seems to be very tiny and high eyes. And one reason they look so high is because usually in Byzantine art, you'll have a veil that comes down right over her forehead. We don't see this. Here we even see some of her hair as well as her forehead. And the eyes are not those tiny little eyes that we sometimes see, or the triangular eyes that we sometimes see in Byzantium. But the nose is sort of long and slender and straight, and then that little mouth that you sometimes see. So they feel that the proportions of the facial features are reminiscent of Byzantine art. But how direct the influence is, I don't know. Now, we mentioned some decorative forms. We mentioned these rocks and the clouds up there in the corner. You see the angel, and behind it there's these white clouds on a cool background. And the clouds, of course, have these scallops, which is a more curving version, I suppose, of there's a similar shape to some of the rocks. They're a little bit more angular. The trees look like tiny little trees. With decorative leaves or blossoms or something on them. And we also see decorative patterns in places like Mary's undergarment, where you can see the sleeve and these star-like golden patterns on her sleeve. And if you look at the hem of her mantle, there's a border that has more patterning. And the shed of the roof, you have this texture that's supposed to give you the feeling of a woven roof. The figures are very slender. Certainly you see that with Mary's arm and her proportions. And they has a really interesting range of colors. He's played with different levels of saturation with these pinkish tones. So, pink is just light red. So what you have are these, very, more saturated reds that you see with the garment that St. Joseph is wearing. You see the angel's garment. You see little touches of the red throughout. And then Mary is wearing this pinkish garment. And then you can see that the midwife has what could be sort of salmon or a light orange garment. So all these warm tones, and then the golden background and the warm tones of the shed roof, give it an overall warmth of tonality. But there are other colors in it, and you can see some very saturated blues in touches here in Joseph's cap, the little cape over the shoulders of the shepherd in the background, and of course that rich blue that Mr. Rosenberg is wearing. One of the most interesting things about this interpretation of the Nativity is what we could almost call genre details. Now, many of these are details that you do see in other works of art. The artist does seem to me, we don't know what he felt, but, I always look at some of these things, you must see like he's having some fun with them, actually. Because he's embellished on things. For example, you very frequently, almost always, in nativities may have up in the corner or somewhere off on the side, the Annunciation to the shepherds. Here we only have one shepherd. And he's sort of shading his eyes and looking out. Is he supposed to be looking over toward Bethlehem and toward the Virgin and the child, or is he supposed to be looking up at the angel up above? But at any rate, here the angel has announced the coming of the Christ child and has this banderole or scroll down with the words on it. And then we look at the flock of sheep, and he's they're not just a little row of sheep. You've got sheep up on the mountainside, silhouetted against the gold background. And then you have a clump of sheep, I guess, or a flock of sheep, of course, who are all sort of piled up, overlapping, as though they've gone to sleep and maybe trying to keep warm. And then up above on the far left of the shepherd, up above the shepherd on the far right is his dog. And his dog seems to be howling at the angel, which is a rather interesting motif. And then something else, we often, almost always see the ox and the ass because they're mentioned in the Bible. So usually we'll see the ox and the ass warming the Christ child with their breath. And the child may be in the manger and their heads are over the manger. That's one legend. The other idea, which we'll talk about later when we see it, is where the ass isn't paying attention and the ox is. But here, both the ox and ass are sort of in the background, and they're eating from something I've been trying to interpret. It's got this little wattle fence around it, this woven twigs or saplings that you will see very, very frequently in northern art as a fence. So is this trying to fence off this tiny little mountain and the angel and the ox and the ass are very big? Or is that the actual manger and there's a heap of grass or straw within it? But what is the really unusual thing? All those are variations on what you frequently see in nativities. Here is something that is really interesting. We see a woman, a servant, or quite probably a midwife, and I'll explain why in a minute. And you see St. Joseph helping to prepare the Christ child's first bath. And they're actually using a tub, which makes sense. And that's a little genre detail here. Very frequently when you see this image of preparing the Christ's bath, it's the two midwives. It's not Joseph. And the bath often looks like a chalice or a baptismal font, and it's suggests that it has associations both with the chalice of the Eucharist and with the idea of baptism. Now, what's really interesting is seeing Joseph here actually being active, actually helping out. Although I'm not quite sure this woman wants his help. You notice he's pouring the water and she's got her hand up like she's stopping him and she's saying, that's enough? Or maybe it's too hot or it's too cold. She's giving directions. But this is a very new interpretation of Joseph. And let me give you an example. I'm showing you an example of a very famous Sienese artist from the very early part of the 14th century. He lived at the late 13th and the early 14th century. And this is a nativity by Duccio, dating from about 1308 to 11. It was once part of the Maestà altarpiece in Siena. And it has some very innovative things for its time, and it also has some elements that are very traditional. And that's what I really want to point out to you. As you can see here, down in the foreground, you have two women who are bathing the baby. And instead of a tub, we have something with a kind of bowl-like or maybe chalice-like shape. Now, who are those women? Well, they're not mentioned in the Bible, are they? Where we would find out about the infancy of Christ would be in the Gospel of St. Luke and a bit in the Gospel of St. Matthew. Luke has most of the story as we're seeing it here. In Matthew, he talks about the coming of the Magi. So we'll see that when we're looking at adorations of the Magi. But in neither gospel are women servants or extra women helping out mentioned. Where do these come from? Well, besides the canonical gospels that were approved for the Bible, there were also some other gospels, and one of these is known either as the proto-evangelium, in other words, starts before the gospels, or sometimes the Gospel of St. James. And in it, it tells the story of the birth of Mary and Mary's parents. And then it tells other details about the infancy of Christ. And throughout this course, we'll be pointing things out that have come from the Proto-Evangelium. In the Proto-Evangelium, when Joseph and Mary arrive in Bethlehem, the birth of the Christ child is imminent. And so Joseph goes out to fetch midwives to help with the birth. But when he comes back with 2 midwives, the birth has already happened. It's a miraculous birth. And when the midwives learn that this is supposed to be a virgin birth, that Mary gave birth as a virgin and still remains a virgin, one of them believes, but one of them does not. And she reaches forth her hand to check it out, and her hand is withered. And then she repents of her unbelief, and the Christ child touches her hand, or she touches it to I think Mary says, touch the child, and her hand is restored to health. So she becomes a believer. Now, here we're only seeing one of these women, but usually, as you can see with the Duccio, usually you have the 2 midwives getting ready to bathe the child. And you can see what in the Duccio, the traditional place of Joseph. Sometimes he's in the background, sometimes off to the side, but he's very inactive. And he's usually seated there, sort of hunched up with one hand resting against his cheek. Or here he seems to be holding his cloak. He looks a little grumpy, doesn't he? Well, he's this old man whose wife got pregnant without his agency. It's by the being overshadowed by the Holy Spirit. So Joseph is not the biological father. And in medieval mystery plays, he's sometimes mocked, in a sense. He becomes a figure of fun. And so, his ineffectuality as far as being the father is shown in the fact that he's just sort of sitting over here on the side. But in the late Middle Ages, there starts to be some theologians, Gertsen is one of them, who start talking about Joseph in a much more positive sense. And this is why I find this image of Joseph so amazing. It breaks with tradition. Because it's not showing Joseph being ineffectual or, sitting off to the side looking kind of glum. It shows Joseph actually helping out. He's being a good father. He's getting the bath ready for the baby. And the idea becomes that Joseph is indeed a good father. He embodies the virtues of humility. And of course, becomes a protector for Mary and the baby Jesus. Now, one of the things that is not found in Byzantine art usually is this shed or stable in which Mary is reclining. In Byzantine art, you usually see the nativity in the cave, and you may have noted in the Duccio image, he does both. He has both the cave of the nativity, the grotto of the nativity, and a little shed. He's responding to both traditions. Why a cave? Well, when St. Helena went to the Holy Land, this was in the 4th century. St. Helena is the mother of Constantine. And she goes to the Holy Land and tries to identify the various sacred sites where various events during the life of Christ took place. And when she goes to Bethlehem, she finds this cave or grotto, which she decides is the place where the birth of Christ took place. And then it becomes a site of pilgrimage. And so the grotto of Bethlehem is what pilgrims would go to see, and what stories about what it would have looked like would have come back. We'll see later on in some 15th century art there is both reference to the grotto and to the stable without being very overt about the grotto. Now, I called it a stable. Maybe it looks a little more like just a shed, but I think it's representing the idea of a stable. That's because in the Gospel of St. Luke, several times it says that the Christ child is laid in a manger. The Christ child is wrapped in swaddling clothes, and they laid him in a manger. Now, where would a manger be? A manger would be in a stable. It would be in a barn. It would be in a place where the animals reside. And so instead of the grotto here, we have something that looks a little bit more like a stable. Now, the master of the Vyšší Brod Altarpiece didn't make this up. It appears in other art as well. And here's something, once again, a bit earlier, in the very early part of the 14th century, 1305 to 6, in the Arena Chapel, the Scrovani Chapel in Padua in northern Italy, by the very famous artist Giotto. And here you see Joseph still in his sort of contemplative, inactive posture, just seated off, while one of the midwives seemed to be helping Mary lay the child in a manger. And it is taking place in a kind of shed or stable. There are other paintings that had been identified as the hand of the same artist, or the workshop, perhaps, of the same artist. And so these are also by the artist that we call the master of the Vyšší Brod Altarpiece, or the master of the Hohenfurth Altarpiece. In some of the older literature, that's what they'll use the German names a lot. But this is not from that altarpiece. It's an entirely different altarpiece. It's a very large altarpiece. It's slightly over 6 feet high. And this is the center panel, which is detached from whatever else might have been part of it. This is the Kladsko Madonna, and it dates from about 1350 to 1360. Now, if we look down at the corner, and I took a photograph of that detail so we can blow it up a little bit, you see kneeling Ernst of Pardubice, the first Archbishop of Prague, also known as Ernst of Prague. And as you can see, he shows this very small figure compared to this huge, very tall Madonna. So he is showing his humility as he kneels before her. And I like to think he's showing his humility in some other ways. Instead of showing himself proud as the archbishop with the mitre on his head and holding his crozier, so that Mary can't possibly mistake that he is an important guy, he's the archbishop, he's actually taken off some of his regalia. He's still dressed in his beautiful garments as archbishop. And right beside him is the cross. But you may notice that right below the feet of Mary on the top step is the bishop's crozier or pastoral staff, which is laid out almost as though he's offering it to her. And then on the edge of the steps, there are the bishop's gloves. And then just below that, on the lower step, is his mitre. Incidentally, Ernst of Prague did write a book about Mary, in praising of Mary. So certainly, like probably just about everybody else of this time period, of the centuries before and after this, he does have a particular devotion to Mary. Well, now let's see how Mary is portrayed and how the Christ child is portrayed and what is their setting. Well, Mary is enthroned in this very elaborate architectural throne. And as we said, she is extremely tall and slender. Now, if you look at the top of the throne, on either side of these pinnacles that rise up, there are two little lions. And this is a very specific reference. In the Bible, it talks about the throne of Solomon. And Solomon, of course, was known as the wisest king. And on his throne, it was decorated with carvings of lions. And his throne was known as the Sede Sapientia, the throne of wisdom. So here, Mary embodies the throne of wisdom. Mary herself is the Sede Sapientia. And Christ is holy wisdom seated on her lap. So she is the throne on which he is seated, and then she is seated on another throne. Well, why is Mary on a throne? Well, Mary, of course, is the queen of heaven. You see her with this rich crown, holding a very elaborate, long scepter. I found it interesting that Mary seems to be holding the orb and cross as though she's sort of holding it for the Christ child while he's doing something else. He seems to be squirming around a bit, which is quite lively, twisting around. It gives you also the sense of space. He's holding a scroll in one hand, and then he's playing with his mother's fingers. So there are some things there that are very childlike about him. But he embodies both the human child and, of course, the divinity of Christ as well. So he is holy wisdom. I want to look at the drapery folds here. You can see that Mary has these beautiful garments, once again, with these very rich colors and a mixture of colors. This sort of, is it pink? Is it purple? Is it lavender? Is it mauve? What is it with the reddish garment and then the blues of the undergarment? Christ is decorated. Well, I was going to talk about the drapery folds. So you'll notice how the drapery folds come around in these very, very graceful curves. And Christ is wearing this gold brocade garment. We have, of course, decorative patterns on the hems of Mary's mantle, on the throne, just in the background, just all over, just this love of that rich decorative pattern, which you saw in the Nativity. And here is carried forth, some of it, of course, in tooled gold of the altarpiece. Your book mentions the Kaufmann Crucifixion, which is also attributed to the master of the Vyšší Brod Altarpiece. So here I thought I would just bring in the picture so you can see it. You have quite a crowd at Calvary. And you can also see something that's very frequent in Northern art, that the thieves who are crucified with Christ are twisted around, and they're really, really, really suffering. Christ is slender, calm, and as you can see, Longinus has pierced his side. The centurion is mentioned in the Bible. Later on, people give him the name Longinus, and the blood is spurting out. And the legend grew up that the centurion was blind, and when he pierced Christ's side, the blood fell in his eyes and healed his eyes, and he believes, he says, truly, this was the Son of God. So here we have some of the suffering and perhaps chaos of the crucifixion. Okay, the second artist that we were going to talk about was Master Theodoric. He is mentioned in the Guild archive, so he of Prague. So we think he may have been a native-born artist from Prague. And what we're looking at are paintings that decorate the walls of the that decorate the chapel of the Holy Cross at Karlstein Castle, which is about 20 miles from Prague. And here's a detail, which you can see the altar side, and you can see that you have these great arches on the wall. And at the lower level, there are crosses and decorative forms formed out of stone in a kind of mosaic, dado there. And then above it, there are rows of rectangular images, mostly of saints of different types. Above the altar, we see at the very top the picture that we're going to look at in more detail, the crucifixion, and then what almost seems to be a little sort of triptych, 3 panels with a man of sorrows in the center. And then down below by a different artist, because it's signed, we see a little Madonna and child, and 2 panels flanking that. And I know you can't see it very well, but this is actually by an Italian artist named Tommaso da Modena, Thomas from Modena. So they think that this artist may have influenced Master Theodoric. The medium of these, they are not painted directly on the wall. Once again, they're on panels or pieces of wood that have been covered with canvas and then painted in tempera, water-based medium. So let's look at the crucifixion on the top, which is, as you can see, slightly pointed, dating from 1360 to 65. And we said this was in the Chapel of the Holy Cross. Charles, the Emperor Charles, is supposed to have built this in order to house relics of the cross. And indeed, these relics are embedded in this crucifixion. There is a piece of the true cross in Christ's chest. I know you can't see these in the work of art, but right beside Christ, in that space between him and Mary, there's a piece of the sponge. And in the halo is embedded a thorn from what is presumed to be the crown of thorns. A bit of metal from the lance is actually in the side wound, and a piece of the nail is embedded within the nails. Now, when I say this, I know some people will come and take me to task. They'll say, well, how do you know that's really the true cross or the crown of thorns or whatever? Of course I don't. But I do know what people believed them to be at the time. So, I'm not making any claims, but certainly the emperor, I'm sure the artist, the people of the time believed that these were indeed relics or sacred remains from objects that were part of the passion of Christ. And so I said it becomes the event. The image actually contains objects that were believed to be actually present at the crucifixion. So it becomes more than just an image showing you what the crucifixion might have looked like. It actually is embodying things that were part of this. And this enhances its holiness, and it, in a sense, becomes a kind of reliquary and a kind of enactment of the crucifixion more than just a painting. It becomes a very sacred object in and of itself. Well, let's look at the style. This is just so different than the master of the Vyšší Brod Altarpiece. Once again, that word that we use with Parler, plastique, comes to mind. You have these very simplified forms. There's not a lot of detail. There's not, gold patterned borders on Mary's garment or anything. The draperies are massive and they wrap the body. The proportions are, once again, remind you a little bit of Ottocar the First, Parler's statue. They're stocky. They're a little short. And the figures seem to be very, very solid. Now, I thought I would show you just a few more images just so you can get an idea what some of those saints look like. And most of them are, half-length images. And this is, sometimes you don't even know which saint they are because some of them do not have attributes or objects that tell us who they are. Now, in this case, we can tell who it is. It's St. Luke. St. Luke, the person who wrote the Gospel of St. Luke, and we call the 4 writers of the Gospels evangelists. It has nothing to do with telemarketing. They are the writers of the gospel: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they each have symbols which are related to the four living creatures that surround the throne of God in the vision of St. John at the Apocalypse, or the book of Revelation, and also the vision of Ezekiel in Christians call the Old Testament. And each one of these four living creatures have been assigned with medieval commentaries to different evangelists. In fact, I think it starts with St. Jerome. At any rate, here is St. Luke holding his open gospel. There's no words written on it that we can see. And once again, you see these very broad drapery folds that are modeled in light and dark and give you a feeling of the solidity of the body. The face seems to be individualized, as though he wants these people to look like individuals rather than just generic saint, generic evangelist. They all look alike. They don't. They have. They look like individuals. They look like. I say real people. Obviously, there's some awkwardness about the way that arm is held up, and you'll see this throughout, as though he wants to show you something very deep and spacious, and hasn't quite figured out exactly how to do it. And you can also see this in his rendition of St. Jerome. Here we have this profile image. You're seeing something very three-dimensional by seeing the gospel book. And of course, St. Jerome was the person who not only was a very famous, they call them doctors of the church, very famous early Christian theologian of the late 4th and early 5th century, but he's particularly known for translating the Bible from the Greek, in which the Gospels and the New Testament was written, and the Old Testament had been translated previously from Hebrew into Greek, which was the literary language of the ancient world. But many people didn't read Greek. And so Jerome decided to translate it into the language of the ordinary people, Latin. We now think of Latin as very esoteric, but the idea was so that everyone could read it. And so Jerome translated the Bible into the Latin of the Vulgate. The idea of the Vulgate meaning it's, the vulgar people, not in the sense that we use vulgar to mean very pejoratively, oh, you're so vulgar, but meaning it as the common people. And that's what the root of the word originally meant. These are the ordinary, or the common people. So this is the Bible for them. As you can see, you have this gold background. You'll see this in innumerable works of art all over Europe. This is a tooled gold background. And we use this term tooled because they use tools. First, you start with a piece of wood. And then you cover that with gesso, which is essentially usually something like plaster and white animal glue. And you can make this very thick. You can sometimes, build it up into almost three-dimensional, say, halos or something like that. Or you could leave it flat. And then you put over that, then you can stamp or tool designs into it. They have a tool, think of it like a leather punch with a design on the end of a cylinder. And you tap it, you put the design edge on your gesso and you tap it. And you can go on and make a repeated pattern or different kinds of patterns. They would have different tools with different patterns in them. And then, of course, you would put adhesive over that. It's sometimes called gilder's clay or red bole because it is red. And over that would be placed the gold leaf, which then would be burnished to shine. Sometimes when you're in museums, you'll see backgrounds that look, really splotchy and red. That's because, the gold leaf is flaked off and you're seeing the gilder's clay or the red bole below it. And so you have to imagine it as gold. Here we seem to have a good deal of the original gold left. Now, behind St. Jerome, we have his reading and writing desk, a little scroll coming over the side, and then on a kind of swivel, you have another level of the desk. I think that's just like another place to put your book, for example. It does look like it might come crashing down. As I said, the artist obviously is trying to show you, solidity and three-dimensionality, but every once in a while it seems to be a bit compressed and perhaps a little awkward, but it's nevertheless a good attempt and I think quite charming. Let's look at the third of these styles. This is a panel from an altarpiece that once resided in the church of Saint Gilles at an Augustinian monastery at Trebon in South Bohemia. Now, you'll sometimes hear this person called the master of the Trebon altarpiece, and sometimes he'll be called the master of the Wittingau altarpiece, which is how I learned him when I was in school, because they used to use the German name Wittingau rather than presumably Slavic Trebon. This dates a bit later. We think about 1385 to 90. And this particular panel is the resurrection of Christ. And it is a remarkable image of the resurrection. Early Christian examples of the resurrection of Christ usually showed what is said in the Bible. You have, for example, the Marys coming to the tomb and seeing the open tomb with the angel there and the angel tells them that Christ is risen. Or sometimes you might see a figure of Mary Magdalene seeing Christ after the resurrection. But in this case, the artist is trying to show you what the resurrection itself may have looked like. And one of the very remarkable things about this is, let's look at the coffin or the sarcophagus in which he has imagined Christ has been laid. And you'll notice that along the edge there are these great big circles. Those are seals. Those are wax seals. If you want to make sure something stays intact, you can put seals on it. And then, of course, if they're broken, you know that somebody's broken in or, in this case, broken out. But the seals are intact. And yet there is Christ. Is he standing on the lid of the sarcophagus with one foot and stepping down? Or, as it almost seems to me, is he hovering there? In any case, Christ has arisen from the sealed tomb. It's a miracle. You can't think that, maybe he just came to consciousness and pushed that tomb open. His actual physical matter has passed through the physical matter of the lid of the sarcophagus. It's a miracle. And it does remind me of a line from a book that was written in the previous century by a priest named Jacobus de Voragine. And this book is called The Golden Legend. It's, of course, written in Latin, so it's the Ars Legenda. But it's the story of the saints, and he goes through the liturgical year with each saint's day. Each date is a different saint, and he tells you the story of those saints. He tells you why this is a holy day. It was intended as a help to preachers because, not all priests were terribly well educated. And, they needed a sermon for each saint's day. And, how could you remember all those saints? So here they have their little handy-dandy manual of the saints. And, of course, it spread beyond just the ministers, just beyond just the priests, to be a handy-dandy guide to the saints. And it's very, very useful for art history because we can often find things in the Golden Legend that explain, what we're looking at. There is I don't know how it goes in the Latin, but in English it actually rhymes, so it's kind of easy to remember. But Voragine says that Christ rose from the sealed tomb as he came from the sealed womb. So there is this equation, in a sense, of the miracle of the resurrection being like the miracle of the virgin birth. So here Christ is being reborn miraculously. Now, the style of this is really fascinating. You can see you have this sort of diagonal sarcophagus, and sometimes people say, well, doesn't that say, wouldn't it be a rock-cut tomb? Doesn't the Bible talk about that? And yes, and sometimes in art you will see the rock-cut tomb, often with the sarcophagus within it. And I can think of examples from Memling and Mezzis from the 15th and the 16th century, and of course Raphael in Italy, in the Vatican. But here we've just seen the sarcophagus, and the rocks have a rocky background here, may suggest the other. The colors are remarkable. Of course, you have this red sky with these bright patterned golden stars on it, and the tiny little trees right behind you that silhouette themselves against this red sky. I suppose I should say something about trees. In Italy, there was a book around 1400 that was the book of the painter, and sort of told people how things were painted. It's by Cennano Cennini. And one of the things it says is, well, when you want to paint a tree, go out and get a branch or a twig and bring it into your studio and use that as your model. And if you want to paint a mountain, go out and get a rock and bring it into your studio and use that. The miniature of the mountain is the rock. The miniature of the tree is the twig. And we do see this in a lot of artists here. So with the master of the Vyšší Brod Altarpiece, certainly with people like Giotto, you sometimes feel that that's perhaps what they've done, or perhaps they simply have an idea of sort of generic tree forms that they use. At any rate, we're talking about the color. You have this bright red of Christ's mantle, and then just slightly less intense, of course, is the red that the soldier's tunic. And then there are some reds in some of the seals. So this, bright, hot color contrasted to the darkness of the hills and the mountains behind him, and this sort of silvery gray metallic color of both the sarcophagus and the armor, the chain mail of the soldiers. I notice the soldiers are really distorted faces, and they're very, very ugly. And there is a whole tradition, we're going to say it right up into Broil in the 16th century, where you show the people who are tormenting Christ as grotesque and distorted to indicate their evil. So, this is a way of showing that these are the bad guys and Christ is the good guy. Also notice the shapes that are used. Your book talks about the flame-like drapery folds, and you can see the cascading drapery on, let's see, but you're right as you look at it. And also this I want to call it a banderole. It's not exactly, but this end of the drapery and end of the mantle that sort of writhes like a flame on, as you look at him, it would be left of Christ. So, it has this almost flame-like shape. And then when you look at the soldiers, they're angular. They are sharp-edged forms, which suggest, once again, agony, pain, suffering, something disquieting. And I just wanted to show you two more images from the Trebon altarpiece. So here we see the agony in the garden, once again, that motif of the red sky, which you'll see elsewhere, and Christ, praying that he will be spared the agony of the cross. Lord, let this cup pass from me. We see in the foreground, separated by the mountain ridges, the three sleeping apostles, Peter, John, and James. And then on the far side, you see the approaching soldiers crowded up here in the corner, led by Judas, who once again has this grotesque face. And then down here, using the diagonal, using the angularity of the forms of the dead Christ to make you feel the suffering we see the entombment. And we also see this motif of the shroud being transparent, so you can see the body beneath it and adore the body of Christ. It also shows off the skill of the artist, that he can do something transparent. Now, the master of the Trebon altarpiece did not only paint suffering, he also could show you the other side of emotion. So that's why I said he's very emotive. Not just expressionistic in the sense of suffering and agony, but also here showing you the tenderness of the love between Mary and the Christ child. And so we have the charming Madonna with the tender emotion. And she's modeled in light and dark, this very soft chiaroscuro, which means light, dark, to show you that the figures are modeled or shaded to look three-dimensional. You'll notice that the Christ child is actually an infant, and he really does look like a little baby. Leo Steinberg has written a book about the gentilia of Christ, which appear very often with Christ's children and sometimes in the suffering Christ as well. He suggests that this is a way of showing what he calls the humanation of Christ. In other words, the emphasis on Christ as human. It's almost throughout the history of theology and art that you have a swing. Sometimes the humanity of Christ is emphasized, and sometimes the divinity. And it's not that they're neglecting the other side. It's like, for this time, everybody knows Christ is God, so let's talk about him as a human and how he suffered and how he loved. And that makes a direct connection with the viewer, the devotee. You can suffer with Christ. And that essentially is how many of the late medieval devotional manuals are written. In the 14th century, there's two very famous ones. One's from Italy, from a Franciscan source, by an author that they used to think was St. Bonaventura, but since they decided it wasn't him, they now call him the pseudo-Bonaventura. And this is the Meditations on the Life of Christ. And the one from the north, from Germany, is written by a Carthusian monk named Ludolf. So he's known either as Ludolf the Carthusian or Ludolf of Saxony. And he wrote this huge book called the Vita Christi, the Life of Christ, in which you are supposed to walk with Christ. In both of these, you're supposed to accompany Mary. You can stand with Mary beneath the cross, and you can comfort her. Thomas à Kempis tells his novices at the monastery of Wildesheim, stand by Mary at the cross, comfort her, succor her, and you may freely do this, and she will reward you. In the Meditations on the Life of Christ, they tell you, we would say you imagine, but they would say accompany, Christ and his mother throughout their life. You should help Mary out. You should bring in the firewood and bring the water, help her with her housework, essentially. And you may take the Christ child in your arms and you may kiss him. And you may freely do this because he came to save you from your sins, because he is your Savior. And so here we're looking at this beautiful Madonna. And they actually have so many of these lovely, charming Madonnas, they call this the beautiful style. And here you see her as the Queen of Heaven, with real gems in her golden crown and this giant brooch on her chest. And yet she is still the tender mother.